like I wrote some
Mhm.
goals for myself. I'm like, I'm going to do these things that I've always wanted to do. So I took 1 year. It started in June. It was on
Mhm.
D-Day, and I wrote down some goals and
Mm.
big goals. And one of those was I was going to lose
Mhm.
100 pounds in a year. I was going to write. I think I said I was going to write, publish, and release
Mhm.
5 books. Like I had a big long list of goals, and over the course of that year, there were a couple things I might not have achieved because I realized this isn't on. That's the thing with goals is like you adjust them as you go, and you realize this is a little unrealistic. We can tweak that, and that's okay.
Welcome to the Maximus Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Cam Sapa. As a clinical psychologist, medical school professor, and CEO, I specialize in helping men be better in mind, body, and masculinity. On this podcast, I interview extraordinary men as a clinician would, hearing their come-up stories of how they became the men that they are today, and having them share their secrets of actionable advice on how to look, feel, and perform your best. All right. Welcome back to the Maximus podcast. We are doing our second segment with Josh Hatcher on actionable advice. I had a great conversation in part one with Josh about the making of the man and the kind of story of his life. And now I want to talk a little bit about kind of, some actionable advice and lessons learned. Um, so I know you do a lot of work around masculinity and men, and you have your manlyhood flags in the back. Tell us a little bit about how you got into that work.
So there was honestly a lot of that was born kind of out of my own struggle to understand it for myself, and it still is. Honestly, sometimes I'm working through things, and I'm like, all right, so if I've got to go through this, I can help somebody else go through it with me. I know we talked earlier about that idea that my pain has a
Hmm.
purpose. So that's a lot of it. Um, but I also just I have done a lot of work with youth and young people and watching these young men grow up into adulthood. And I actually was like a youth pastor at
Hmm.
a church for a while, and these boys were becoming men, and then they were getting arrested for child porn or drugs or overdosing and dying. And I mean, I like so many, I lost so many of those kids to horrible
Hmm.
situations, whether they either, like I said, just all these things happened. And I'm like, what is going on? Like I invested so much into these kids. And when I look back, I really recognize and understand that the ones that had the hardest time were the ones that had no real active father
Mm.
figure or mentoring in
Right.
their life. And so that was kind of what started the drive for starting it. It honestly has become, the men I help aren't just men who need a
Hmm.
father. I mean, uh, the men that need a
Hmm.
brother. And like I said, it helps me
Hmm.
too. That's people. Anytime that I create something, a lot of times it's what I need to
Hmm.
hear. It's what I'm researching and learning for myself and trying to put into practice, and seeing work and fail and come together. And um and that process and that journey for me, and I'm sharing it, and honestly just trying to kind of build that community out of it. And it's been a really interesting journey. But that's where it
Hmm.
started, was just with that goal of and looking at the men's space at the time, because I've been doing this for a
Yeah.
long time. um and looking at the men's space at the time, there was Men's Health Journal, and there was
Hmm.
Maxim. And I'll be honest, if you pick up their advice
Yeah.
columns, dude, that is not an example of a
Right.
good man.
Right.
It really isn't. It's like it's just cosmopolitan for
Yeah.
men. And the people that are guiding that, the people that are giving you advice, that's not helping you be a better man. That's just helping you get more notches on your
Hmm.
belt, or helping you look better when you walk down the street. Like, we needed to get deeper than that and get real with that, and start talking about things like purpose and value and missions, and the things that
Hmm.
matter. And that's kind of, I think, what propelled it. I wanted to make sure to offer something and start having conversations that I felt men were not having.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, your point about the lesson that you learned about, a lot of problematic behavior stem from sort of a lack of father figures, whether they're physically present or emotionally, quite frankly, present in people's lives. It's something that I think America is waking up to. I think that's quite frankly why Jordan Peterson is so popular right now, is he plays sort of the wise father figure for so many people. And I have a very parallel journey. Like I think the archetype that I try to play for other people is kind of a brother figure for folks, because and obviously the counseling role that I play as a psychologist, we very much do that one on one. But I can't see more than dozen people a week, and being able to use these sort of social media and other forums allows you to reach and play that role in a much wider figure. Um, so I love to hear a little bit about how you've been sort of spreading your message. I know you wrote a book called Manlyhood: The 12 Pillars of Masculinity. Can you talk a little bit about that, and what some of the most important pillars are?
Yeah, the first pillar, and honestly, this is the most important pillar, and I think that everything else hangs and falls on it, and that's personal
Mm,
responsibility. I think that, and as I was writing the book, a lot of it was coming out of it. Actually started as blog posts, and I'm like, I think I could put these together and actually make it a book. And so I actually just put them together and made a book, and then I read and I published it, and I read the book, and I'm like, boy, this is bad. So I took it offline, and I called my buddy, and I'm like, can you help me edit this? And he actually went through, and he's like, we can
hmm
fix this, and kind of helped me bring it together and make a little more sense out of it. And but that first pillar of personal responsibility, like um I think of my son's Boy Scout leader who used to say all the time, if it is to be, it's up to
mm,
me. And as a kid, I didn't get this, and I remember my dad saying it all the time. You have to take responsibility
right.
for your actions. You can't blame everybody else all the time. And I hear it all the time. It took forever, and honestly, I still struggle with it sometimes. Like if you look around, you can always find a reason
hmm
why it's somebody
Right.
else's fault. You can even find a reason why
hmm
it's your fault. You know, the blame game has no
mm,
winner. There is no winner in the blame game. And so if you're trying to find fault, then all you do is you're just placing blame. That just says it's your fault we're in this
hmm
mess. It's my fault we're in this mess. That does not get anybody
hmm
anywhere.
Yep.
Responsibility says this is that. So my dad would say that, and then my mother would say, I remember her saying all the time, I don't care who made the mess,
Yeah,
somebody
right,
clean
right.
it up.
Yeah.
And it's where responsibility says it doesn't matter whose fault it is. I'm going to be the one to
hmm
make it right. I'm going to be the one to put in the work to take care of this problem or make sure that the problem is
Right.
taken care of. Because sometimes leadership is delegation, but I'm going to be the one to take responsibility for making
hmm
sure it's done and
Yep.
done
Yep.
right. And um and that's the first pillar. Other pillars that I think are important are the concept of covenant or commitment.
Mm,
That when you make a promise, you
yeah.
keep it. Um,
By the way, I think that one is
and
really fascinating, because even when someone takes personal responsibility, they're like, okay, yep, I'm not blaming anyone. It's my fault. This is the way my life is not ideal. They often fall short on the covenant piece that you're talking about. Like they don't make the commitment to change it because they're like, I don't know, I'm trying, it's not really working, or I have a lot of other conflicting reasons. So, can you talk about how does one develop commitment, or when they say they're going to do something, they follow through on their word?
so I'll be honest with you. So there are areas of my life that I do a great
hmm
job with this on. There are areas of my life that I don't do a
Sure,
great
as is
job with
true of all
this.
of us.
And I think that that's important. So I know that this is a pillar of masculinity, but there are times when there are going to be people who are going to look at my life, and they're going to people who are waiting for me to finish things I said that I would do. And they're going to say, what kind of man are you? You talk about this and you're not doing it. And then there are other people who would look at me and say, man, when he said he was going to be there, he
hmm
was. And so I would say that really we need to strive for it in every area of our life, because another pillar is integrity, which I'll talk
Yep.
about in a minute. But we strive for it, we shoot for it, and so looking at my life, and I know that covenant, that making that. So I would say with my marriage, that's a good example of a place where I said, we're going to stick this out no
hmm
matter what. The D word is not in our vocabulary. It's not going to happen. We'd rather be miserable and make it work than to be miserable and not make it work. We're going to stick it out, and we're in this till death, and um, the things that I'm learning about the other areas where I'm not as successful in this are, um, like, I'm recognizing that we all have those barriers that we
Mhm.
have to overcome that hold us back, those excuses that we latch onto. And for me, like, I hate pain. I
Mm.
hate pain. I do not like it. And I'm, this is actually a fairly recent revelation for me, where I'm recognizing and understanding that I do fine until it
Mhm.
hurts. And when it hurts,
Yeah.
I'm out. I'm out. I'm done. I don't need to
Mhm.
feel that. I'm not doing that. And so, but that's not commitment.
Yeah.
That doesn't win.
Right.
That doesn't succeed. And that's not manly. So that's an area of my life that I'm learning and trying to work through, because, like, and I can think of a dozen places in my life that I struggle with
Mhm.
that right now, to be
Yeah.
honest with you. I mean, if I compare it, like, if I give myself, I think I'm pretty good at assessing myself. My wife thinks I'm a little generous in assessing myself, but I'm going to give myself like an 85. So I'm at
Good.
least a B, you know?
I think it's
But,
more than most people, to be honest. And maybe the answer to the question is the covenant starts with just accepting actually the fundamental premise that your word is bond, right? And I think people understand that when it comes to other people, right? That, like, generally, if you make a promise to someone, you should keep it. And I think most people probably try to do that. But the funny thing is, we don't apply that to ourselves, right? Like, when you tell yourself you're going to do something, but maybe it's because we don't speak it out loud, and there's no one watching, there's no one checking up on you. Obviously, when you're an adult, for the most part, especially if you're a man, you're kind of in the deep end of the pool by yourself for the most part, maybe other than your family. It's like if a tree falls in the woods and there's no one there to hear it. It's kind of like being a man, is the analogy that I make. But I think covenant changes when you say, you know what, I'm going to act as if everyone was watching. Because at least I think the parts of you are watching. If you believe in a soul or a spirit, you could say that's watching, right? And I really do think people underestimate the harm that they do to themselves when they don't follow through on their word, right? We know this, in fact, from an analogous field, which is like guilt, right? Like, if you cheat, and even if no one else finds out, people carry guilt, right? Because if you're not a psychopath, which is really rare. You have a conscience, and you end up punishing yourself even when you get away with it, by knowing that you did something wrong, and you carry that guilt, and literally you can measure it, right? Your cortisol levels or other stress levels, you carry it around. I think it's the same thing when you don't follow through on your commitments. Even if no one else notices, or there's no huge consequence to that, at least immediately, there's always a consequence eventually, especially when it comes to things like health. I do think we suffer a little bit. So I think part of what you can do is just, like, I actually encourage my clients to write down their commitments, even if it's a little thing. Like, what am I going to do this afternoon? Write it down. Like, that's a part of a system I have called the Keystone Habit. You spend 4 minutes writing what you're going to do for the next 4 hours. Whatever it is, it doesn't have to be super ambitious, but just make a plan, and then at the end of the 4 hours, you go back and say, did I do what I said I was going to do? If not, let's analyze why. If you did, let's support or reinforce the things that you did right, and then let's iterate and do it again for the next 4 hours. But it can actually be very life changing, because people don't sit there and they don't realize, like, that they don't, oftentimes, first of all, people don't make commitments in the first place, especially when they come home after a long evening at work. They're just like, I don't know, maybe I'm gonna eat dinner, maybe I'm gonna spend time with my family, but I have no plan, right? Sometimes that makes sense. Maybe if you have a family, the plan takes care of itself, in terms of you have innate responsibilities that you have to take care of. A lot of people, I think, if they're coming home, particularly alone, they make no plan, and their evening gets frittered away. And so it is life changing when you come up with something, anything that you say you're going to do, and then you check, because now you have a written record of it, whether you did it or not.
It's interesting that you talk about that in a 4
Hmm.
hour block there, that macro or
Yeah.
micro version of it. Cause, like, I actually had, like, I'm going to say, I don't remember what year it was. It was a couple years ago. I actually had, like, this massive change in my life where I just said, like, I wrote some
Hmm.
goals for myself. I'm like, I'm going to do these things that I've always wanted to do. So I took 1 year. It started in June. It was on
Hmm.
D-Day, and I wrote down some goals, and
Mm.
big goals. And one of those was I was going to lose
Hmm.
100 pounds in a year. I was going to write. I think I said I was going to write, publish, and release 5
Mm.
books. Like I had a big long list of goals, and over the course of that year, there were a couple things I might not have achieved because I realized this is that's the thing with goals is like you adjust them as you go and you realize this is a little unrealistic. We can tweak that, and
Mhm.
that's okay. You give yourself that permission. But I did. I started that year, dude, at 420
Wow.
pounds. I ended that year at
It's amazing.
320 pounds on 1 year to the day,
Mhm.
on D-Day, 1 year later. And I published, I think, 6 books actually
Amazing.
that year. Um, and there's lots of awesome and amazing other things that I
Mhm.
did as well. A few things that I didn't do that year, and it was
While having
awesome.
4 kids, no
But
less.
yeah, and they were all at home at
Amazing.
that time
Yeah.
too. Um, but and in that time frame, I also lost my
Mm.
father. He got sick, and there was a whole lot going on there that happened. So there was some grief, there was all kinds of things that happened. I also had some health problems as a result of they started to rear
Yeah.
their ugly head. The health problems were hemorrhoids, so it's funny that I used the word rear their ugly head. Sorry. I have no
Well, yeah.
shame. I've given up shame. But the I gave up shame for Lent. It's not Lent, but anyway, the I was eating keto and not eating
Ah,
enough fiber, and so dude, like I already had a problem and it was accentuated. So all of that, just like I hit the end of that year after, like, it was a hard year, and it was like, this is
mhm.
awesome. I'm gonna take a little break before I make another set of
Yeah,
set of goals. Like I ran that year like a
totally.
marathon, and then you know what is like I have slacked off a
Yeah.
little bit since then. And again, I've had some things, not excuses, but I've
Sure,
had
sure.
issues that have where you're like, okay, I can't do this
Mhm.
because of that. Things happen. But then you let that thing become an
Yeah.
excuse. So I haven't gained back all of that weight, but I've gained back a big enough chunk that it's
Mhm. Yeah.
uncomfortable, you know. Um I also have gotten out of habit of
Mhm.
a few things, and dude, the whole COVID
That's
year,
yeah.
man, like all of the mental disciplines that I had built to get me
Mhm.
through that year. um, you know, I hit June, so that would be 6 months after my
Mm.
dad died. Then I actually
Yeah.
started grieving. So, then after from that point on, man, like I lost all my mental disciplines, and then COVID hit, and I that 2020 was a
Yeah.
wreck for me. It was a real wreck for me. And so looking back, I'm like I will say there were things that I was good at that I succeeded in, and I can take some wins on my overall
Mhm.
tally sheet, you know. But dude, I had a lot of losses in
Yeah.
2020 in the way that I handled things, in the way that I processed things, in the way that I let things go because I didn't take the time. But some of the lessons that I learned, I
Mhm.
think, through that is like setting a
Mhm.
goal and even accomplishing a goal isn't really as important as actual
Mm.
transformation, right? Like like the what the year of success proved to me is that I'm
Right.
capable of it. There are things I can do that I didn't know
Mm.
that I could do, and I need to do those things. Then 6 months of grief and hemorrhoid problems and surgery and recovery from that, and then a year of just insanity and
Yeah.
laziness have taught me that if I do not practice discipline, that's where transformation happens. Because like it- you know, keeping a goal
Sure.
takes discipline, and that's important. But it has to be more than just okay. I did that. Now
Mhm.
I'm done.
Mhm. Yeah.
And so that's some of the things that I'm learning and
Right.
working through right now. And I tell you that story because you
Mhm.
bring that up, and I'm like I'm seeing that whole kind of thing
Yeah.
play out. We're talking about that covenant and what that looks like, dude. Like um I told myself I would never go
Mhm.
back, and I went
Yeah.
back on that, and that's not good. So, and you pay the price for that.
Yeah.
And I'm telling you, dude, like it sucks because some of your guys that are
Mhm.
watching might be like, "What does he know about anything? He was this fat guy telling me anything about being healthy." Dude,
Yeah.
I know because I know what I know. I'm going to tell you right now that if you're
Yeah,
not healthy, it
for sure.
costs you. Being overweight is
Yeah,
painful. It physically hurts
right.
like hell.
Yeah.
Don't do it. Do not do it. It is not worth it. Like, get it under control, because it's harder to lose it than it is to
Yeah,
gain
for
it,
sure. Absolutely.
you know?
Yeah, health is very easy to undo, very hard to gain back, as I unfortunately have learned working with all kinds of people, inpatient and outpatient. I think that's also true of your mental health, unfortunately, as well. It's much easier
Mm,
to try to, like, just maintain. It's actually not that hard, I actually think, to
mhm.
maintain mental health. It's very hard to gain it back when you're in a bad state. And there's physiological even reasons for that. But I appreciate
Sure.
your sharing your successes and your failures. I think that honestly increases your credibility, and that's true for all of us. Like, the reality, especially with weight loss, because I spent a decade actually of my career kind of focusing on obesity and diabetes. Like the overwhelming majority of people actually who lose weight gain it all back if you follow them long enough, right? Over the course of like 10 years plus. However,
Right.
so that's the bad news. It's really hard to maintain weight loss. The good news is that's on average, right? And this is what I call the error of the average, right? You look at the average, you're going to be very disheartened, and the conclusion you'd make is the weight loss programs don't work, actually, right? And that's true on a population level. However, on an individual level, you don't care about the average. You care about the exception, and you can be the exception. In fact, there's a whole directory. I think it's like the National Weight Loss Control Directory, something like that, where it's a literally a directory of people who've lost, like, I think 10% or more of their body weight and have kept it off for 10 years. And I think, I don't know, it's probably like over 10,000 people in it, if I recall correctly. So I think that is heartwarming and optimistic that, like, you can always defy any average. So I'd love for you to share that story with our follower base. Regardless of where people are starting at, I do think it takes a lot of discipline to be able to lose 100 pounds in a year. So can you talk to us about your weight loss journey and what were the things that worked for you? What were the things that didn't work for you?
Yeah. So I would say this: if you're on that upper end of
Hmm.
things, right? For me, I used a
Yep.
ketogenic diet. I ate dirty and lazy
Hmm.
keto, which works.
Hmm.
It works. It will
Yeah.
help you lose
And what do you
weight,
what do you mean
and I
by
didn't have
dirty
to
keto
count.
for the folks who aren't familiar?
So dirty or lazy keto. So like, lazy keto doesn't necessarily count all of the
Mm.
macros. You basically uh, keep it under 20 grams of
Yeah.
carbs a day, net carbs a day, um, and eat whatever you want. So I lost that 100 pounds mostly eating, um, you know, cheese and
Hmm.
pepperoni and bacon and eggs, and things like that. And some of those
Yeah.
things are good, but what I didn't do is I didn't have
Yeah.
enough fiber, and so like I talked about that earlier, like that wrecked my guts,
Hmm.
dude. And so I already had a problem, and I had been to the doctor, and the doctor said I can't even do a hemorrhoid surgery on you because the equipment that we have can't hold
Wow.
you.
Yeah.
So if we're going to do a hemorrhoid surgery, we have to send you 2 hours away to a hospital. And I'm like, I don't want to do that
Hmm.
right now, because that's going to be a 2 hour
Sure.
drive back wide awake.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so I kind of put that off and went through and lost that weight. And I would say, you know what, a ketogenic diet will
Hmm.
work. You'll lose weight. But if you want to do it right, you've got to do it healthy, and you've got to take the time to make sure that you get your green leafy vegetables. And if you don't like them, then take some
Yeah.
supplementary fiber. You can get fiber that doesn't have
Hmm.
sugar in it, and take that to help kind of keep things moving, because if not, it's gonna
Yeah.
shred you. And not like the good
Right.
shredded,
Right.
like the bad shredded
Yeah.
on the inside. And dude, so when I went back to the doctor, I went back and I'm like, hey, I've lost 100 pounds. I think your machinery can hold me now. And he's like, it can. And he went in and he did the surgery, and I had to kind of change my diet because I needed to
Yeah.
eat differently after that. Um, and and that was the first thing, is because what I was doing was working for me losing weight. And if I went off plan at all, if I changed what I was eating at all, I would start
Hmm.
gaining again. And so that was a struggle at first. Um, and so I really had to kind of work on that. But that surgery was, it was bad. It was the worst pain I'd ever experienced. And he
Hmm.
told me that that was the worst case of hemorrhoids
Oh,
he'd
wow.
ever worked on. So he said the scar tissue was bad. He said there's actually some stuff that's still, in there that might still bother you, but it's not going to bother you as
Sure.
bad as it did. And I remember it was right before Thanksgiving, and so here I am. I have to eat a certain way afterwards, and I'm like, it's Thanksgiving. I'm going to just splurge just a little bit, and I splurged literally just a little tiny bit off of this doctor's plan, a tiny bit. And that night, dude, I'm like, it was like somebody took a freight train and tried to run it through a
Yeah.
plastic straw, man. And I thought I was gonna die. And I remember, like, I have this buddy. I live in community
Sure.
with men, and I've got these guys in my life that we communicate. We're close, and I'm like, dude, I think I popped. He's a nurse, and so
Right. Right.
he's
Right.
seen everything, and like I don't want to call my doctor, So I messaged my buddy. I'm like, I think I popped a stitch. He's like, how do you know? I know this is too much information. Like half of your listeners are like, I'm done. I'm out. But it was a really hard and rough experience, and I tell that story honestly as a
Yeah.
warning sign, because if you are going to do a ketogenic diet, dude, like people will try to tell you, I still
Yeah.
believe in keto. I still do. People will try to tell you, oh, it's bad for your heart, it's bad for your cholesterol. Look, fat is
Sure.
not bad for you. Fat is not bad for you. And if you eat a high fat, moderate protein, and low carb diet, and if you are morbidly obese,
Right.
you will lose weight. And the other thing that I coupled with that, and this is something uh, that I actually think was also huge because it like
Hmm.
amplified it, was to I would do intermittent fasting
Yep.
3 days a week. So what I would do is I would stop eating at about 8 o'clock at night, 7 or 8 o'clock at night after dinner time, and then I would wait until uh, either 1 o'clock was my lunch
Hmm.
break at work, or I'd wait till like 3 o'clock, depending on how I was doing. Like if I could go till
Yeah.
3, I would. But what I had to do is I had to eat before I
Yeah.
came home, because if I went home, and I hadn't eaten anything, I would be really mean and grumpy. And my wife was like, "You have
Yeah.
to eat something before you
Fair
come
enough.
home."
Key part of the ketogenic
But
diet.
yes, yeah, you've got to eat something if you're going to do intermittent fasting. And intermittent fasting works for
Hmm.
any kind of diet. It can help amplify it. Um, you basically have an eating window where you're eating
Hmm.
in your window, and then when you're in your not eating window, you're fasting. And if you time it right, most of that time you're sleeping. You know, I know everybody's like, "Oh, breakfast is the best meal of the day," and it is. But if you do this right, you're just eating your breakfast later. And I would drink either black coffee or
Hmm.
bulletproof coffee, with some butter and coconut oil blended up. Sometimes a little bit of cinnamon to
Yeah.
give it a little flavor. Sometimes a scoop of cocoa just to give it a little bit of flavor. Um, Maybe a little bit. Sometimes I put a little bit of stevia in it just because. Um, so like I can drink black
Yeah.
coffee all day long, but if I put the
Yeah.
other stuff in it and it wasn't sweet, it just was a little
Fair
too
enough.
oily for me. So I put like a little bit of stevia to give it a little bit of sweetness. Um, and I drink that and drink a lot of water, and that got me through.
Yeah.
So that was my weight loss
Hmm.
journey. That got things going, and I was doing really good. Then, like I said, I hit that after that surgery. I had to start
Sure.
eating
Yeah.
differently, and in that process, I got out of the habits that
Yeah.
were working. And again, when I say things were working, they worked to lose weight, but they weren't necessarily
Right. Right.
healthy. Because I wasn't doing keto the way that I
Yeah.
should do keto. And so I would say, like, if you're going to do a ketogenic diet, you should do it where you're having, you know, every meal you should have either a low carb, like low glycemic, like strawberries or blueberries or
Yep.
blackberries or something like that, or a handful of
Hmm.
spinach, or heck, you could throw a handful of spinach and a handful of frozen strawberries in the blender with a little bit of heavy cream and a little bit of stevia, and you've got a great smoothie. You don't even taste the
Yep.
spinach if you're like me and you don't really like it. But that would help your
Yep.
insides to be able to process what it needs. But make that more the source so that you're not, you're getting healthier things in you. you
Absolutely.
know.
Yeah. And I think this is an
Um,
important story to share because I think there are different ways of doing keto. I don't know if there's an optimal way, but just as a quick touch on the research literature, I do think increasing consensus is that ketogenic diets are probably the most superior diet for weight loss, and particularly for the treatment of diabetes, right? So if you have problems with blood sugar
Hmm.
control, obviously cutting carbohydrates, which gets absorbed into blood sugar, is probably the superior diet, right? And so there's companies like Virta Health, for instance, that just do ketogenic diets for patients who have type 2 diabetes. And I developed the nutritional curriculum for Amada Health, which I would call a lower carb diet, not necessarily strict keto.
Hmm.
Um, but that also works, right? So Virta's version developed by Volek and Finney, they define keto as less than 50 grams of total carbs. I think the reason they do that instead of the
Hmm.
20 net that you mentioned is because unfortunately there's a lot of like these keto foods nowadays that focus on net carbs, but they have a shit ton of um, uh, excuse my
Yeah.
language, but like these artificial
Yeah.
fibers that aren't the ones in the
Yeah.
blackberries, raspberries, and strawberries that you mentioned. Um,
Or
yeah, so
sugar
sugar alcohols
alcohols
and a bunch
and
of stuff. And so they're, are they keto? Technically, but they meet the requirements in the label if you're counting net carbs, but they're often also ultra processed and not that great for you. But people look at it and they're like, oh, I'm on a keto diet. I need to buy keto foods. Some of them are actually good, but some of them, you got to read the label. Like, for instance, a lot of the keto bars, I think because of how bars have to be manufactured, require a ton of those fake fibers and sugar alcohols in order to
Mhm.
make them bind and taste decent, right? So you're getting, like 30, 20 plus grams of carbs, but they're just not, net carbs. And you can't have too much sugar alcohols. That also ruins your GI system, right? You can tolerate a little bit of
Mhm.
erythritol, but any of those sugar alcohols, because they're not natural and the human microbiome doesn't really digest them the same way, exceeds our tolerance, and then you literally just get gas and GI sort of issues. So that's one thing. And the other thing. So by the way, I think I love that you mentioned the intermittent fasting. We actually had Dave Asprey, who invented bulletproof coffee and wrote the book Fast This Way recently.
Mm.
Check out that episode if you want to dive deep into intermittent fasting
Yeah.
and bulletproof coffee. And Dave's obviously a great resource for it. But also, we had JT on the show who talked about how if you're particularly very active, you can even have more than 50 grams. So I think he consumes like 100 grams of carbs, but he's measured his blood ketones and he's still in ketosis. So the thing that we advocate is I kind of always tell people lower your carbs to the amount that you're willing to do and able to sustain long term. Now you can do it
Right.
Atkins style where you cut it to like the 20 to 50 range like we're talking about. You do it temporarily while you're losing weight, and then you slowly reintroduce carbs back once you're at your goal weight to just maintain it, right? And that's going to be different for everyone
Mhm.
because everyone's carbohydrate tolerance, so to speak, is different. Like if you're really on the diabetes spectrum, you may not be able to get away with consuming many carbs. Some people process them, metabolize them decently well, and so they can consume more. I think you kind of have to like play around and find what works for you. But I think there is one key thing that I want to emphasize from what you said, which is the importance of fiber. Carnivore diets are very hot right now. It's a type of keto where obviously you just consume meat. It does work really well because, well, I mean, if you do that, you're oftentimes cutting out most of the ultra processed stuff, and then you're obviously cutting out carbs.
Mhm.
So I'll be cutting excess, particularly refined carbs and ultra processed food. You're of course going to lose weight. The problem though is I do think fiber is important. Like all of the hunter-gatherer societies and ancestral societies, none of them actually eat keto. Very rare, right? Like maybe like extreme examples in the Arctic Circle, Inuit maybe eat close to keto, but everyone else consumes like I don't know 20% of their calories from carbohydrates, and a lot of that is just because of fiber. The importance of fiber, I think, is especially when you're consuming a high-fat diet, even though fat is not bad for you. Some people's cholesterol on keto, some people are fine, some people are a little bit hyper
Mhm.
responders, but we do know that fiber helps regulate your lipids. So if you want a particularly good lipid profile, even though there's a lot of debate about what's good in terms of LDL, HDL, I think fiber is very helpful. So what I generally encourage to those folks is, I think the optimal diet's what I call hypercarnivorous. Hypercarnivorous being greater than 70% of your calories come from animal-based products. And then 30% can be sort of plant-based. And there's variance. I've seen some people do 50-50. Native Americans traditionally eat about 85% from animals if you're trying to follow sort of like a traditional template. But I really do think you need, some of that, maybe 30%, to come from plant-based stuff, which means fiber. And I think it really does almost like counterbalance it. So sometimes I talk about this on social media. In my opinion, the optimal diet is almost like an alkaline ketogenic diet because meat and meat animal products are very acidic. And so
Hmm.
consuming plants that are particularly low in what's called a PRAL score. It's the potential renal acid load. It's basically a score of how much minerals or electrolytes come with your food: potassium, magnesium, calcium. Um, uh, and so it helps sort of negate or counterbalance all the meat. So, like an example of this is like baobab, which is an ancestral fruit in Africa. It's super high in fiber. It's like half fiber because it hasn't been genetically modified, like like these giant strawberries that we eat nowadays that are farmed. Which,
Hmm.
well, wild strawberries, if you ever see them out in nature, are tiny. Baobab, they haven't messed with it for thousands of years. You're eating it just like it used to be, and so it's a very high fiber food. You can consume it with a lot of meat, and it helps kind of balance things out. So that's one. I think it's a great tip you mentioned. Like if you don't like green leafy vegetables are really good in terms of like the nutrient density. So if you like salads, great, have at it. I do encourage people to not go nuts with the spinach and kale. Like people who are having, because JT mentioned, I think he was having like 3 cups a day of spinach or kale, and he actually developed kidney stones from the excessive amount of oxalates in it. So
Hmm.
uh, have it, a reasonable amount in moderation. But the other thing is like also, vegetables aren't actually very ancestral. If you look at hunter gatherers, they don't really eat vegetables. They eat berries and tubers. That's the interesting thing, right? So you can get your fiber actually from ancestral fruits and from tubers. Tubers being like root based vegetables, like think about like potatoes and turnips and things that are carrots, things that grow basically below the ground. So you can get a lot of fiber even if you don't love vegetables from fruits and
Hmm.
tubers, fruits, roots, and shoots. I think this is what they call them. So
Yeah.
I think this is what people have to experiment with, right? And I don't think you need to love
Yeah.
everything that you eat. You can't probably hate it. It's not going to be a sustainable diet. But yeah,
Right.
the fiber. I think optimizing for protein and fiber is like will get you 80% of the way there if you just make sure you have enough of those two nutrients in your diet. We always say like 0.82 grams of protein per pound of optimal body weight is amount of protein that you should eat. And then it's unclear how much fiber we actually need. I think the US RDI is like 20 to 30 grams of fiber. But the Hadza who consume baobab, they're consuming like 100 to 150 grams a day, and I don't think any of them are like less than 1% of them have diabetes. You probably can't take on too much fiber at once. It does cause gas if your microbiome, as you mentioned, hasn't built up. So I always tell people when you're consuming fiber, whether from natural or even supplemental sources, you gotta work your way up. Your body has to get used to consuming that much fiber. I think I probably consume like 50 grams actually a day, which is pretty high from the baobab and other things. And actually don't eat that many vegetables. I'll have a salad every once in a while. But I've learned that through trial and error and also from reading literature, kind of piecing together kind of things. So I think what I take away from you and also from kind of the experience that I have clinically and working with patients is um, don't follow things as like strict rules of thumb. I think they're guidelines, but you have to kind of adjust
Mhm.
them to kind of do what fits you in your life.
Yeah, I think that's what I have experienced as well is like if it's sustainable, I can do it. If it's, if I'm always I'm realizing and understanding how much of this is in here,
Absolutely.
how much of this is in my mind, where like if I start thinking about ice cream or pizza and how I can't have it, that's all I'm
Right.
going to think about, And so I'm working through a lot of that stuff too because I'm also recognizing and understanding, like I said, I mentioned earlier, the whole
Yep.
pain thing, and so the momentum that it takes to add exercise to this is very difficult when you're starting at a
Sure.
deficit in the pain, and so I keep cycling into that place where I'm like, I need to get moving, I need to get lifting, I need to get
Mhm.
walking, and I need to do these things. But it
Yep.
hurts. And so, I figure if I'm going to walk for half an hour, the first 5 minutes
Mhm.
hurts and I'm good till the last 5 minutes and it
Mhm.
hurts again. And if I can, and so I'm learning how to push through that. And what I'm recognizing, and I guess this is one of those revelations I've had recently, is how much, like, I think my whole life I have just basically just shuffled pain
Mhm.
around to different places of my
Yep.
life. And so it's not just a physical thing. Like there's a
Mhm.
metaphysical thing, where it's like, um so I know that's the stuff that I've been working through right now and recognizing, like okay, I know that I am capable of putting in the hard work
Mhm.
to lose weight. To quote my friend Nick Matash, I have to now do the heart
Mm,
work so that I can do the
mhm.
hard work, because there is some some things in here that are messed up that have me thinking that the ultimate goal is
Yeah,
pain avoidance. And as a result, I'm not doing some of the hard things I need to do because I don't want to do them
yeah.
because they hurt. And so I'm processing that. And that's part of the challenge. And not to, we were talking about the nutrition end of things, man. Like, uh we did uh paleo
Mhm,
and whole 30 for a little while at different points. I'm gonna tell you, dude, like, if anybody is in a place where they're like, my life is a wreck, my nutrition is a wreck, and I don't know
mhm.
where to start, I would tell them, like I can't stop
Yeah,
eating bad foods. Like, if it's a mental thing, like, I would always recommend the concept of a whole 30, where you're taking
mhm,
30 days, you take 1 month and you eat nothing
mm,
but whole foods. Like, for me, and that's basically like a
yeah,
modified paleo. But for me, like, that was actually the first thing that happened kind of before I did that year. And it helped me to definitely change my mind
yeah,
about food. um because I I was down in, pizza and candy bars and non-diet sodas every day, and like to take 30 days and not have any of that and only eat certain kinds of foods, and then the foods that I was eating were
mhm,
good for me. Like, it actually changed my mind in so many ways. Like, I actually hated black coffee before that, and now I
mhm,
actually prefer it. Like, it actually
yeah,
changed that in my tastes in doing that. So if anybody's at that place where, like, I just can't stop eating this bad food, like, I would highly recommend doing that because it helps change your
yeah.
relationship with food.
And I think it's a
Um,
good point. I hear that all the time, by the way, about sweetness, right? Like I do the same thing. I don't eat sweetened things, with the exception of maybe like some chocolate every now and then, other than like natural fruits. But yeah, I can't tolerate like artificially sweetened stuff now, because it's like a Coke has, I don't know what, 60 grams of sugar, and it's like it's disgustingly sweet to me now. So your equilibrium almost like goes back to what I would argue is normal, right? And everyone else is like, their tolerance for
mhm,
sweet things is so sky high because of the ultra processed food culture, right? 66% or two-thirds of American calories come from ultra processed foods. And so when you go on something like a whole 30, like you mentioned, I think really the benefit is, you just eliminate a lot of junk that comes from your diet.
mhm.
And so anything that does that and makes people, feel better within a certain period of time, I think can be very positive for folks.
They kind of joke about. I remember somebody had printed off a calendar for me when we were going through it, and they, like, about day 15, I think you hit the phase that they call tiger blood, where, like all of a sudden you get this crazy energy and clarity that you've never
Mhm.
had before. And so, like, and I've experienced that with intermittent fasting too, or even just fasting. Like, if you do like a 2 or 3 day fast, there's like this point where you hit this place where you're like, wow, that really stunk up until now, and now all of a sudden I have energy and I don't understand where it's coming from. And it gives you a
Yeah.
strength, that kind of comes from that place of almost having nothing. I don't even know how it makes sense. So, but I love it. I think it's kind
Amazing.
of neat.
Well, I think it's incredibly valuable that you share your journey, and you do it with such a humor and humility that I think is very valuable to our listeners. Is there any like, kind of like final last words of wisdom, inspiration, advice that you'd like to give folks before we wrap up?
Yeah, man. Really, beyond everything else, I think the most important thing is take the time to get people in your life that will hold you accountable, that'll call you to higher, that you can have
Hmm.
fun with. Oh my gosh, that's the one thing about masculinity and manhood, and the concept of a
Yeah,
band of brothers that you need is just have some
yeah,
fun, man. Like everybody is so serious about everything all the time. Like, um, it's when I don't know about you, but when I get together with guys, like, we're like lighting off firecrackers and doing crazy things and pulling pranks and telling jokes and goofing off and having fun. Like you're gonna when I'm with my kids, we're telling jokes and laughing and singing songs and being goofy and, like, have
hmm,
some fun, because if you don't, like like I think that's, believe it or not, I think that's probably one of the most
Yeah.
important things you can do. I think that you're going to find joy in your life, and you have to look for those moments when you can find it and enjoy it. Have fun with
Yeah.
it, you know?
No, that's very valuable advice. In fact, I was telling I work with very serious clients, obviously, like running companies. I literally I gave someone homework the other day. I was like, you need to do something that you enjoy because you're like a super young CEO that's like taking their life a little too seriously. I don't think it's true for everyone, but that's probably what that person needed. And it's good to hear even like someone who's done so much in your life continuing to say that even in later life fun is valuable. I call it play. Like, I think,
Hmm.
just like you were talking about growing up, right? Like you play in the water, you play in the woods. I don't think that need actually goes away as an adult. I think we repress it, right? Because we think, oh, we're grown up, adults don't play anymore. I think that the type of play can mature. It could be like shooting guns and doing other things that maybe like kids can't do as much. But we need it, whether no matter what the form is. So I'm actually really glad that you share that, right? Like everyone talks about accountability. Yes, that's important. We have a Discord group. We have 1,200 guys in it in terms of our community, and it's all about accountability, right? Like if you're sticking to keto, then there's someone who's like keeping you accountable for doing that. But I think that's why we use memes. Like that's the humor, that's the fun, and at
Right.
least in an online forum,
Right.
right? We can't be lighting off firecrackers online, unfortunately. But I'm so glad you mentioned that because I think that's underappreciated for men and men do really like I think appreciate humor in a very like special way and I think that's also a good. I actually shared that as kind of a tweet the other day. It's very related. I was like every guy needs someone that they can like basically like joke with or share memes with, right? You need like one person who you like
Yeah.
you find something funny, it's mildly inappropriate, maybe you can't share it publicly or at work, but you need
Right.
someone to like
Right.
laugh, be able to laugh and have that inside humor with. And I'm so glad that you have that. And yeah, and obviously both of the work that we're doing, I think promotes that. So on that note, can you tell our listeners where they can find you, whether it's your community or your writing or your books?
Yeah, yeah. So the best place to start would be if you go to manlyhood.com, and we've got a podcast there. And if you go to Amazon, you can find the books that I've got. You can also get them on
Mm-hmm.
Manlyhood as well. Um, and joshhatcher.com is another site. I need to do a little work on that, but
Mm-hmm.
it's still there. That's kind of my personal blog where I've got some more poetry and some of the things like that I've written. But and we've got a Facebook group online similar to what
Yep.
you're talking about, where some guys can connect, and I like to try to challenge the guys there a little bit every day. And podcast, YouTube channel, all that stuff. You can find all of that if you just go to the website
Perfect.
manlyhood.com.
Awesome, Josh. Such a pleasure to have you. Such great and rich experiences that you've had in your life, and your honesty and humility and authenticity just come across so much. So I think this will be a very very valuable podcast for our listeners, and I appreciate you having you on.
Yeah, I appreciate you too, man. You've actually given me a lot of good things to think about too, and some very helpful information when it comes to the nutrition stuff. I think there's some stuff there I can really learn from. So I
Awesome.
appreciate it. Thank
Absolutely,
you.
man.